We have to talk about the live-action remake of Pinocchio. More than most remakes, more than even most Disney live-action remakes, the live-action remake of Pinocchio is a shadow of its former self. Sanitized until it's as wooden as the titular character. But also, more than most remakes, this made me upset. And when I feel that anger bubbling up inside of me, watching as they treat the literal symbol of Disney, one of their original classics, an iconic movie I grew up with, a film generations have grown up with, as if as long as they have a puppet, a cricket, and Geppetto, they can call it Pinocchio and get away with it, I have to tell myself, it's only a movie. It's only a movie. It's only a movie. Right? Some remakes are good, some are bad, and then some make us mad. Really mad. Why? Stories are more powerful than you think. Especially stories we loved when we were growing up have a strange tendency to form the very essence of you. But before we go deep on this, let's start at the surface level. What even is a remake? Whether we're talking remaster, reboot, reimagining, or remake, we're talking about a promise. First, there's a remaster. A remaster promises the same exact thing with almost imperceptible changes that make it slightly newer, which stands in stark contrast to the reimagining. The promise of a reimagining of a property is a new spin on an old story. Tim Burton's Alice in Wonderland was a reimagining of, well, Alice in Wonderland. It completely changed the plot, focusing on the Mad Hatter and a giant battle between the Red Queen and the White Queen. Or it could put a new spin on just the characters, keeping the story mostly the same. Cinderella got a reimagining in 1997, featuring black actors in most of the starring roles, including Brandy as Cinderella and Whitney Houston as the fairy godmother. I would even consider Charlie and the Chocolate Factory a reimagining, as Tim Burton completely reimagined Willy Wonka himself. It promises something new. So the promise of a reimagining is the same story with a new twist that might even get you to rethink what you already knew. Then there's the reboot. The promise of a reboot is a fresh retelling of a property that we already know and love, set in the present day. A reboot promises a fresh cast and a fresh director. It might be grittier, more realistic, or more cartoony. For instance, Adam West's Batman
I'm Batman
was rebooted with Tim Burton's Batman,
I'm Batman.
which was rebooted by Joel Schumacher's Batman,
I'm both Bruce Wayne and Batman.
which was rebooted by Christopher Nolan's Batman,
I'm Batman.
which was rebooted in The Batman.
I'm Vengeance.
No, you're Batman. Zack Snyder has a Batman in there too, but I'm not sure if that counts.
The Bat is dead.
No, that's your cinematic universe. Each reboot, we got a fresh perspective on the same story. Joel Schumacher wanted his story to be more pulp, more like a comic book. And after Batman and Robin failed, Christopher Nolan had full reins to direct a grittier, more realistic Batman, which kicked off a trend in superhero movies at large. Spider-Man has had 3 reboots, and we're probably due for another one soon, each time witnessing Peter Parker get his powers in our modern day. Halloween had 2 reboots, one by Rob Zombie and one by David Gordon Green. Rob Zombie decided to go all in on Michael Myers' backstory, which John Carpenter hated. And David Gordon Green totally ignored every film besides the first one, so it's sort of both a reboot and a sequel. Ocean's 11 was a reboot that led to its own film series, which then got a reimagining when it starred an all-female cast. Ghostbusters did a similar thing with a reimagining starring an all-female cast, which failed spectacularly, triggering a reboot. But the reboot featured one of the daughters of the original cast, so was it a reboot or a sequel? So the promise of a reboot is essentially a retelling of a story we already know in our current time, which brings us to the remake. What is the promise of a remake? A remake promises to give us the same feeling we had when we saw the original. It promises to deliver the same themes, the same feels, the same hero's journey as it did when we saw it the first time. It's a reimagining light. It's a remaster to the max. Change a little, but not too much. So the thing about a remake is it has to have a reason, because if the original is still watchable, why update it? Turns out, for a remake to be necessary, there has to be some kind of evolution. But to think about that more, we have to go deeper. Back in the early 1900s, film was just starting to break out as a medium, but every film was silent. Filmmakers did what they could to deliver on the promise of the story they were telling, but were extremely limited by the lack of sound and dialogue. And once the film industry developed technology to record and play back sound,
"You shall see darkness cover Egypt when the sun climbs high to noon."
silent films became instantly antiquated, impossible to watch for those who never experienced them before, without the benefit of nostalgia. Many classic films we know today are remakes of silent films we've never heard of. One of the more notable classics, The Ten Commandments, released in 1956, was a remake of his original silent black and white film of the same name that released in 1923. And it makes sense we've never heard of it. It doesn't have any frickin' sound. So how could it deliver on its promise when viewers from today would be so bored they'd stop paying attention? Film would go through many more evolutions, but none as monumental as the addition of sound. But still, the majority of viewers who didn't grow up in the 50s, 60s, or 70s would probably have a hard time sitting through even the remake of The Ten Commandments. Because in 1956, movies were slow-paced and the acting was not realistic. But not all old films need remakes. Like, no one wants a remake of Taxi Driver. Taxi Driver was Martin Scorsese's big debut into the world of feature film that launched his own career as well as the careers of one of cinema's most iconic actors, Robert De Niro, and the young Jodie Foster. The film is grungy, the stock is grainy, the setting is old, unfamiliar. But when Martin Scorsese set out to make his film, he was met with minimal limitations. The film stock caught De Niro's acting perfectly well, and Scorsese's direction made sure that it translated perfectly onto film. Sure, we have LED lights now, but the tungsten lights they used on set at the time lit their sets just as well, even if they blew out a few fuses along the way. Every filmmaker sets out to deliver on the promise of their film, and for decades and decades now, filmmakers have had the ability to deliver on their promises with little to no limitations. Taxi Driver, even though it's old and grungy, still fulfills its promise, even to new viewers. Taxi Driver marked a period of evolution in cinema, where films shifted towards a more realistic acting style, so it's still very much watchable today. But there's more than just evolution in style or evolution in technology. There's also evolution in worldview. Sometimes you'll be watching an old movie and cringe because of blatant racism or sexism. Older comedies don't always work because the humor is topical or outdated. In these cases, a remake is welcome. Remakes are even older than film itself. The first ever remake in Western history also happens to be the most influential. The entire Judeo-Christian creation story, God saying, "Let there be light," making Eve from Adam's rib, was a remake of the Babylonian creation myth Enuma Elish. Back in 6th century BCE, the Jewish people were held captive by the Babylonians and had to assert their identity in the face of Babylonian culture. Back then, religion and culture were one and the same. In fact, the creation myth was almost a genre of storytelling in and of itself, and helped form the identity of those who heard it. The Babylonian creation myth depicted a violent start to the world with many gods who were jealous, petty, and violent. So the exiled Jews produced a remake. In their remake, there was only one God, who was all-powerful. The start of the world was not violent, but a result of their one all-powerful God willing it into existence. They knew how important stories were to people's identity, and asserting these fundamental differences between them and the Babylonians assured they would stay united as a people. And today, we're not so different. These days, I hate remakes. When a new one is announced, I cringe in fear instead of cry with joy. I should specify, when a new film remake is announced. Video game remakes are almost always great, and that's because video games need remakes. Have you tried playing the first Resident Evil game lately? The graphics, I'm sorry to say, are trash. It's still one of my favorite games of all time, but no one who didn't grow up with it is going to pick it up and play it. So, what makes a remake necessary? No one is going to watch the original is the best reason for a remake I can think of. Whether cinema has evolved past the style of a film, the technology has evolved like it's frickin' silent, or I can definitely see the strings. That being said, in film, there have actually been a lot of remakes that I love, that I had no idea were remakes in the first place. And that's the way I like it. If a movie is so old, so antiquated, so outdated that we forget about its existence, remake away. Or if a movie is foreign but also so good, remake those too. So many of these films established themselves as iconic that it didn't matter if it was a remake. True Lies is one of my favorite movies. Scarface established itself as a classic well beyond the original. The Departed is iconic. Father of the Bride is hilarious. A lot of these movies are just so good, even if you knew they were remakes, you're like, cool. And a big reason we still love them is because they include archetypes that have worked for generations. They don't throw away what we know is good already. Father of the Bride might be an ancient movie, but the remake kept the archetype of the doting father who can't give up his daughter to her husband. And then there are a lot of remakes that I knew were remakes but didn't care. You'll notice there are a lot of horror movies on this list. Horror movies are remade all the time. There's something about a horror movie that really cements it in its time. And a horror movie can only be scary so many times before you know what's going to happen. Well, cheap horror movies. They also rely on a lot of special effects, which don't always age so well. The Shining is still scary, but also a lot of these remakes were star vehicles or had some other star power going, which gave it a reason to exist. Like, oh, let's see Rob Zombie's take on Halloween. Peter Jackson did so well with Lord of the Rings, let's see what he does with King Kong, even though it was already remade. House of Wax had Paris Hilton. They kept the spirit of the original Ocean's 11 alive by making the new one also a powerhouse of celebrities. The Nutty Professor starred not just 1, but 8 Eddie Murphys. A Star is Born exists specifically to push the career of whoever is playing the Lady Gaga part, and a lot of these films came out so long ago that they really could improve on the scope, like with The Mummy. And of all the Disney Live Action remakes, I think I'm the only one who liked the photorealistic Lion King. It looks so good. And 101 Dalmatians was a classic back in the mid-90s, mostly because neither of them touched the originals. They kept the archetypes, the universal human experiences that made us all relate to the originals. So we've gone over what is a remake, what isn't a remake, why remakes are more precious than a remaster, a reimagining, or a reboot, some good reasons for remaking a movie, like if it marks an evolutionary shift, or if the original is so old no one remembers it or will watch it. But to figure out why a remake makes us mad, and some are just bad, we have to go deeper. No one cares about the Nightmare on Elm Street remake. People who loved the original still have the original, and the new one is a slightly new take. Freddy is a bit more, well, you can find out for yourself, but it was pretty universally panned. But people weren't outraged, it was just disappointing. Even if I saw it as a teen and loved it, no one is going into a Freddy Krueger movie to learn lessons about life. And the fundamental archetypes and themes are the same. It's not like they made Freddy the good guy, so people exit the theater thinking being a serial killer is a good thing. But in Pinocchio, I don't know if I could say the same thing. In Pinocchio's remake, one could argue they're teaching their audience that lying is good. You know, the opposite of the lesson of the original. And this is a kids' movie. Kids are impressionable. We all remember this because we were all kids at one point. The original Pinocchio is a moralistic tale about the dangers of being a bad kid. And even more than that, it's remained in the public consciousness for almost 100 years. Because the original Disney adaptation of Pinocchio just so happens to be a perfect archetypal story that encapsulates what growing up is. The remake took a big Mickey Mouse-sized dump on it, and people definitely got mad. Just from a storytelling perspective, it's bad. Pinocchio is the tale of a wooden puppet who wants to become a real boy, and does bad boy things until he realizes the error of his ways and selflessly rescues his father from the belly of a whale. In the original, Pinocchio is a bad kid. He doesn't know any better. He's doing what feels good. Once his dad isn't around, he cuts class. He's enamored by fame and leaves town. Once he escapes the puppet show, he's led to Pleasure Island where he gets sick from smoking a cigar. Pinocchio's nose growing when he lies is so iconic that literally every kid knows what you mean when someone says to them, your nose is growing. The clear moral here is that lying is bad, and it will just get you into worse trouble if you lie more and more to get out of it. It's better to tell the truth. In the remake, I shit you not, instead of bold-faced lying to the blue fairy to get out of trouble until eventually telling the truth and she lets him out, he tells weak lies to Jiminy Cricket for almost no reason at all. Then his nose grows, he realizes if he lies he'll be able to reach the key with his nose, he lies to get the keys, and then frees himself from his cage. But that's not all. In the original, he wants to be famous when it's offered to him. In the remake, he does it because it'll make his dad proud. In the original, Jiminy tries to get him to go back to school, but he says no. In the new one, he does go to school. And then they added a scene where he tries to go, but he's kicked out because he's a puppet. In the original, Pinocchio starts turning into a jackass because he's participating in Pleasure Island. In the remake, he doesn't do anything bad. He sits there looking uncomfortable the whole time. I get it would be weird to show a kid smoking or drinking today, even though it's to teach kids not to do it. But have him do something bad, my God! The whole lesson of the thing is that being a bad kid will turn you into a jackass. Pinocchio does nothing bad and still starts turning into a jackass. What's the lesson here? And the worst of it is at the end of the original, Pinocchio almost dies from saving Geppetto, but since he gave his life for his father, he's transformed into a real boy. In the remake, Geppetto is almost dead, and Pinocchio's tear saves Geppetto's life. If you're thinking none of this is a big deal, Pinocchio still hears Jiminy tell him not to lie, Pinocchio sees the other kids get punished for being a bad boy, so it's the same thing, then I think it's time we go deeper. But before we do, this video took weeks to make, and honestly, just watching this thing I made is humbling beyond belief. If you want to support my work, I've got a fledgling Patreon that you can join for as little as $1 a month. So even if YouTube demonetizes this video for any number of reasons, I can still keep making more. But above all else, I want to grow my channel, and likes, comments, and subs make a huge difference. Alright, so let's go deeper. Let's talk about a remake as old as time itself. Let's talk about the hero's journey. Throughout the centuries and cross cultures, human civilization has always told stories. Joseph Campbell dedicated his life to researching stories from all over the globe and across time. He's written many books, but the most notable are The Hero with 1,000 Faces and The Power of Myth. In The Hero with 1,000 Faces, he describes what he calls the monomyth, which is essentially the archetypes and narrative structure that is common among even human civilizations that never knew of each other. The hero's journey resonates with us on a deep level. How often have you listened to good advice from a friend or parent? Probably not too much. But when that same advice is demonstrated in a film or through a story, it's a lot more likely to stay with you. And the way the human brain is ordered, it's especially primed to take in moral lessons via stories. This is why the Bible is full of stories instead of just saying, do this or do that. And even now, in the 21st century, the monomyth is the rule, not the exception. If your screenplay does not include a hero's journey, then it's probably going to fail. For a good example of this, we can look to Star Wars: A New Hope. George Lucas openly used the monomyth to make Star Wars: A New Hope. He went so far as to call Joseph Campbell My Yoda. No wonder it started one of the most successful film franchises of all time. Let's look at the hero's journey through the lens of Star Wars: A New Hope. But first, in short, this is the hero's journey summarized by Radiance.org. The hero is introduced in his ordinary world, where he receives the call to adventure. He is reluctant at first, but is encouraged by the wise old man or woman to cross the first threshold, where he encounters tests and helpers. He reaches the innermost cave, where he endures the supreme ordeal. He seizes the sword or the treasure and is pursued on the road back to his world. He is resurrected and transformed by his experience. He returns to his ordinary world with a treasure, boon, or elixir to benefit his world. And if you didn't already fill in Star Wars, I'll do it for you. In Star Wars: A New Hope, Luke, our hero, starts in the ordinary world. He's just a normal farm boy until he gets Princess Leia's message. This is the call to adventure. Then the hero first rejects the call because, just like all of us, he fears the unknown. But he's encouraged by a wise old man or woman, aka Obi-Wan Kenobi, the mentor. And the mentor will often give magical weapons, in this case, the lightsaber. Then our hero passes through the threshold into the unknown, where he encounters tests and helpers. In Star Wars, he goes to the cantina where he meets Han Solo. Meanwhile, Obi-Wan teaches him about the Force, and Luke starts to trust it. At this point, our hero reaches the innermost cave, a dangerous place. In Star Wars, this is when they get to the Death Star to rescue Princess Leia. He faces his fears and overcomes them. Then, the ordeal. He faces the possibility of death. Here, in the bowels of the Death Star, Luke is trapped in the giant trash masher. Luke is pulled under by a tentacled creature, and for a moment we think he's dead. Before he's born again. We have been identifying with Luke, so when he's on the brink of death, we are too. And when he's transformed, we are transformed. This is also around where the mentor often dies, as Obi-Wan does in A New Hope. Next, the hero seizes the sword. In this case, it's Leia and the plans to the Death Star. Next is the road back, where the hero must fight his way out of the cave. In Star Wars, it's back home from the Death Star. The resurrection is next, where the hero emerges from the unknown world, transformed by his experience. This is where Luke and the rebels take on the Death Star. Luke uses his knowledge of the Force to aim for the weak point, destroying it. Last is the return. Luke returns victorious, with all involved receiving medals for their heroic journey. His life transformed because he chose to confront the unknown. This is every movie you love. Christopher Vogler, a creative development executive for Disney, circulated a memo during the making of The Lion King, applying the monomyth to film. And since then, Hollywood has been all monomyth all the time. All your favorite characters, Katniss, Frodo, Harry Potter, Simba, Nemo, and yes, Luke Skywalker, are all remakes of the hero with 1,000 faces. But this myth is so prevalent, they didn't need a memo. Film executives were already using it. Even the most prevalent myth in the Western world, the story of Jesus Christ, follows this same structure. But where Jesus differs from all of these mythological heroes is that he actually historically existed. And whether or not he performed miracles or was literally God, he lived the monomyth in real life. According to C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, this is the difference between Jesus and others. Christ is a true myth. Now, I'm not trying to convert anyone to Christianity here, but merely showing the immense power of this archetypal story. An archetype is a universal concept that appears in stories across cultures. Every part of the hero's journey is an archetype. Pinocchio is full of archetypes. He enters the unknown when he dives into the ocean to escape Pleasure Island. The ocean could be full of sharks, or it could lead to his salvation. He represents the sun and Geppetto, the creator. The creator needs the sun to rescue him from the belly of the whale because Geppetto is old and can't see with the same eyes as his son can. Pinocchio has to face that his father can't always help him because he realizes his father doesn't know everything. These are all archetypes that resonate with us because they are universal human themes. So the remake of Pinocchio sucks because they're ignoring the hero's journey. We're supposed to experience the world through the hero of the tale and with them become transformed. But Pinocchio isn't a bad boy. Pinocchio has nothing to learn. So we, the audience, learn nothing. Pinocchio is not transformed, so we are not transformed. This is the same with new Star Wars movies and almost all big blockbusters coming from Disney today. A combination of wanting to be more inclusive by casting female heroes instead of males, which is not a bad thing in and of itself, but at the same time wanting to be inoffensive, so females are not allowed to learn anything. They're already perfect at the outset. They can't be a bad boy like Pinocchio, they have to already know and just realize that they've been perfect all along. These new films have been less successful than films from the past because they deny this fundamental storytelling. Seeing someone who's already great continue to be great and then also be great at the end is not compelling. It doesn't inspire. But why is this so important? Because the other half of this is that stories are powerful vehicles to communicate values and impart lessons on the audience. I mentioned before the difference between showing and telling. Stories show. When Pinocchio uses his nose to get the keys and free himself from his cage, that's showing. At the same time, Jiminy tells Pinocchio that lying is wrong and he should always tell the truth. That's telling. In the end, what we're shown is what's imparted on us. Do as I say, not as I do has always been a fool's statement. So where films impart morals is what the hero has to overcome. Every film has a theme, and the combination of the theme and the hero using that theme to overcome whatever it is they're fighting against, inside or outside, is the lesson the audience learns. A lot of times it's believe in yourself, or be yourself, or lies get you in worse trouble, something like that. And at the very least, the audience can think, well, if the hero can do it, I can do it. if this normal, unspectacular guy can answer the call to adventure, I can too. If they're at their lowest point and they decide to act instead of lose, I can too. Movies may seem like a pastime, but they're actually extremely powerful. In the story of Jesus, the theme is to sacrifice yourself for others, give to the poor. Even this guy who literally is God washed the feet of his disciples. Be like him. Be like Luke Skywalker. Do the hard thing. Face Voldemort. Don't shirk away from responsibility or the hard thing. It's hard to be the chosen one, but offer yourself as tribute to save your sibling. The New Testament doesn't just tell you to do things, it shows you through the literal best man being treated the absolute worst, and he still persists in forgiving those who treat him like dirt. These are values we can get behind, and something like Pinocchio totally denying the hero's journey makes those of us who loved the original cringe a bit. If it's something new, that's different. We can hate those movies too, but when it's a remake, it hits harder. It's clearer. It's almost a rejection of what made the original good, or at the very least, they're being careless with something that's weirdly personal. But what makes it so personal? Like, I'm never more excited for something than a remake of a favorite video game from when I was a kid. There's actually an answer. We're almost to the bottom of this. All the way to the core of who we are. My dad is in his 60s right now, and the TV is always flipping between the Patriots and Turner Classic Movies. My dad would have no problem watching the 10 Commandments every day. But every time I walk in there, I could care less. I go on my phone, I go into the other room, I complain and ask, why can't we watch John Wick or something? It's hard for these films to fulfill their promise to me because film has evolved past its style by the time I was around. But for my father, the 10 Commandments and Turner Classic Movies are a big part of his identity. He can enjoy both realistic movies and presentational epics from the 50s because that's when he was forming his identity. Maybe instead of walking in and getting instantly bored, it would help to look at old movies as a kind of window into the soul of a generation before my own. A picture of their values, their morals. These stories unified people in common values and created a national identity. Remakes are core to the human DNA. Every 7 years, your whole body is a remake. Our cells are constantly shedding and replicating, and in 7 years, there's no physical remnant of the you from 7 years ago. Every atom, every cell, every physical manifestation of you is a remake. Every child is a remake of their parents. Entire generations are remakes of the last. So if your body gets a remake every 7 years, how do you know who you are? When it comes to movie remakes, some are good, some I shrug off as just bad. But what about when a remake makes you mad? Makes you feel betrayed? Why is that? The way I see it, we feel that way because when it all comes down to it, the original is you. Where religion used to form a large part of people's identities, movies, TV shows, video games, and music have all filled in the gap and become an important part of our identity. When we see a good movie, we talk to our friends about it, tell them to see it. We take joy in sharing it with others. If they like the movie too, we can be friends. It's so deeply rooted, if you loved a movie and your best friend hated it, you might think there's something wrong with your friendship. As I mentioned before, the building blocks of our physical bodies are constantly changing, and our brains need something to hold on to. A reminder. Nostalgia. Vsauce has a fantastic video about nostalgia where he talks about the lifespan retrieval curve. Nostalgia gives us a good feeling, and we have a lot more nostalgia for the period in our life known as the reminiscence bump. It's a period of time between 15 and 30 where our brains are creating memories in overdrive. So many memories formed at this time are especially nostalgic. Growing up, we often change opinions, we learn skills, we forget who we used to be. But one of the jobs of our brain is to keep a steady identity, despite the fact that we are technically not ourselves. Those memories formed in the reminiscence bump form our identity. Not only were our brains primed to store memory after memory, but our lives were full of memory after memory. We went to school. We were challenged every day. We were surrounded by friends, enemies. Everything was new to us. We joined clubs. At home, we had our moms, our dads, who were at times excruciating but also instrumental and irreplaceable. We were so excited to find our favorite band, our favorite movie, our favorite author, and especially to find others who felt the same. And as we get older, we interact with others less and less. This graph is depressing. As we get older, the time we spend alone increases exponentially. And all we have is our memories of the past. Memories of the time spent with family, with children, with friends. And now, working from home, we don't even have time spent with our coworkers. So nostalgia works in overdrive to remind us of who we are. It latches on to the past, the good times, the time spent with loved ones, the time we experienced these great journeys alongside Luke, Leia, and also alongside our best friends. Those friends we thought would never leave us. Those parents we wanted to be around forever. But Luke also lost his parents, and he got through it. Pinocchio had to realize that his dad didn't know everything. Katniss looked at change and said, "I offer myself as tribute." Harry Potter saw friend after friend die, but he persevered. No matter how low your lowest point has been, all of our heroes have been there and somehow made it through, and also came out on the other side, better for it, transformed. Answer the call to adventure. So when our favorite films are remade carelessly, when these archetypes and themes are thrown away, we wonder what happened to our favorite stories. Why don't they resonate? What's wrong with filmmakers that they're doing this? So when it all comes down to it, why do we get mad about remakes? More mad about remakes than about something new? For the same reason we get so excited about remakes, because the originals are personal. They helped form our identity, and our brain uses them in our daily lives to remind ourselves of who we are, even while our bodies are constantly changing. The original took us on a journey, a hero's journey, where we personally identified with the hero. We died with him, we transformed with him. Through him, we saw how to live, how to overcome obstacles, even when they seemed insurmountable. So when a remake comes out that's at best careless and at worst denying who we are at our core, it's disheartening. So I'm here to tell you, your feelings are valid. But despite all of these feelings, if you have to tweet about it, try to be nice. I'm Daniel Paul. I'll see you next time.